I'm Dr. Carlos K. Hill, professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. I study the history of lynching and racial violence in the United States. My presentation today will be about understanding the 1619 Project and its significance to our discussions of slavery and its relationship to the American present. And so with that, the key questions, the key objectives that I want to answer today are threefold. The first question is, what is the 1619 Project? So much has been said about it, but there's very little clarity, I think, in our debates about its merits, what the project actually is. And so what I want to do today is try to clarify that as best I can. The second question that I want to engage is, why is the 1619 Project so controversial? There have been many op-eds, essays, television, town halls about this project and why people are so frustrated with some of its conclusions, interpretations, as well as why so many see in the 1619 Project a kind of prophetic telling of America's past, as well as its present and future. And so we'll dive into why the 1619 Project is so controversial. What I'm most excited to talk about, though, is why the 1619 Project matters. At the end of all this debate and discussion, why will this project matter? And how does it help us mark, right, the 400th anniversary of the arrival of enslaved Africans to the Americas? And so those are the key questions and objectives for today's discussion. And so I'll just jump right in. What is the 1619 Project? I think this question has to be answered if we're going to really understand why people are so upset. And so in August of 2019, the New York Times published the 1619 Project. And this project was envisioned as telling a sweeping history, multimedia history of American slavery and its legacies. And this was done not just because the New York Times thought it was a great idea, but it was done to mark the 400th anniversary of the arrival of 20 enslaved Africans to British North America or to Virginia. And so the New York Times set out, right, to mark a 400-year anniversary and to reflect on what slavery has meant to the enslaved, what it has meant to this country, and how it still impacts us today. And so not only was it seeking to inform, right, but if you look at the masthead on to the left, it was also about telling the truth, telling the unvarnished truth about the American past. And so this was I would argue, an ambitious project from the beginning. And so to help us understand it a little bit more, I want to go a little bit deeper. One of the misconceptions of the 1619 Project is that it's an essay, right? Or it's simply a podcast, or it's simply a collection of stories, right, about slavery and its impact. Or some people have simply reduced Nicole Hannah-Jones' introductory essay as the 1619 Project. And so in order to talk about the 1619 Project most clearly, we have to understand it as a multi-authored digital history, right? So existing mostly online, containing 10 essays written by historians and journalists that explore the contemporary links between contemporary American life and the legacy of slavery. Now, it also includes a series of original poetry and fiction. There's even a photographic essay that helps anchor the other essays to sort of place and time. And so the 1619 project is much more than just an essay, right? It is this multi-authored, multimodal educational experience that the New York Times curated. In addition to that sort of written content, there is I believe a 5-episode podcast. There is a high school curriculum, a supplementary curriculum. And in November, or I believe December, the 1619 Project book will be released by Random House. And so the 1619 Project, for all of the attention on the introductory essay, is this large, right, expansive even project in which multiple individuals, not just Nicole Hannah-Jones, contributes to its vitality. And so the 1619 Project, for all of the contributors that made it possible, I think it still is correct to say that the visionary, the founding visionary of this project is Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine. And so Nicole Hannah-Jones deserves to be talked about as the visionary or the founder, because she is the one, I believe, who sort of envisioned this 1619 Project as a way to tell a kind of people's history of the United States that would offer, right, not a new telling, but a bold retelling of the history of American slavery, as well as the development of American democracy. And so, despite the fact that there are multiple contributors and consultants who work with the New York Times, who work with Nicole Hannah-Jones, we can see her as the kind of project's visionary, the project's even conscience and soul. Like, she has, in so many ways, been on the lecture circuit defending the project against its harshest critics. And so she, both as a kind of visionary, but also as a kind of defender, has been front and center with the project. And so now that we kind of put that on the table, I just want to share with you some of the, in micro, I want to share with you some of who some of the contributors were, and some of the perspectives that they bring to bear in the essays that they write for the 1619 Project. And so Nicole Hannah-Jones, right, in her introductory essay states, "Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written." And I want to repeat that, because that's a profound statement. Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans, so she's not saying all Americans, Black Americans have fought to make them true. This is a harsh criticism of America and American democracy. This is a harsh and bitter truth for Black Americans. And Nicole Hannah-Jones pulls no punches here, right? This understanding, right, of America, founding ideals were false when they are written, is foreign, right, to many Americans, and especially the tone in which she's writing here, she's channeling here, is uncomfortable for Americans to hear, right? But this is the tone and the tenor of her introductory essay. And she makes many other similar points throughout. And so just her tone alone and some of her most profound conclusions, I think, are hard and difficult truths for many to swallow. You have Matthew Desmond, the brilliant Princeton sociology, has taught us so much about eviction and the significance of eviction in American life. He writes about slavery and capitalism. And one of the conclusions from his essay is, quote, if you want to understand the brutality of American capitalism, we don't need to understand Adam Smith. We need to understand plantation slavery or slavery to understand why American capitalism is as ruthless or brutal as it is. So centering slavery in the conversation about America's present and an institution that many see as a sort of benign economic system. Matthew Desmond is tying it to the evils of slavery. And again, that is a hard and bitter truth, I think, for some to admit, let alone swallow. You have Jamel Bowie in another essay. And Jamel Bowie is the New York Times columnist and journalist reporter. He states America has held on to an undemocratic assumption from its founding, meaning the American Revolutionary period, that some people deserve more power than others. And so Jamel Bowie, again, perhaps a harsh truth that the American Revolution did not represent liberty and equality for all. Rooted in that revolutionary era was the denying of thousands of enslaved Africans, right, the right to freedom, the right to liberty, the very things that the Declaration of Independence and ultimately the Constitution held up as the most sacred of human institutions. And so Jamel Bowie, again, offering a very harsh critique of the founding generation and the American Revolution. There are so many contributions in the 1619 project that are worthy of discussion. I just want to mention a few more. Bryan Stevenson. Many of us are familiar with Bryan Stevenson because of the recent movie about his life, Hollywood movie about his life, but also because of his work with the Equal Justice Initiative and the Equal Justice Initiative building of the Peace and Justice Memorial that tries to tell the story of American slavery through public art. Bryan Stevenson in his essay stated, slavery gave America a fear of Black people and a taste for violent punishment. Both still define our prison system. And so with that statement, he's implicating Americans today in the history of slavery. He's implicating our system, our penal system in being implicated in the history of slavery. For many, this is a foreign concept. But when you center slavery and the enslaved in the telling of the United States, these are some of the conclusions one might draw or come to. Khalil Muhammad, a Harvard historian, and done beautiful work on understanding the criminalization of Black people and Black bodies. In his essay, he writes, the sugar that saturates the American diet has a barbaric history as the white gold that fueled slavery. Looking at what we eat and the kind of cash crops that support what we eat, Khalil Muhammad is trying to again show us that this history of slavery has not yet passed. We're still living, and as Bryan Stevenson would have it, we're still living in the era of slavery. The idea that slavery is gone and we can put it in a box in the past, they're trying to explode, right, through their provocative essays, this idea that somehow slavery no longer matters, right? That slavery somehow was a part of the American experience, but isn't a part of the American experience. They're trying to explode that. And so I applaud these men and these women for the work that they're doing to try to help an American public that's done very little on the national stage to memorialize and to commemorate slavery until we've created a Juneteenth holiday to ensure that we do. Before that, our consciousness about slavery and our awareness of the ways in which slavery is impacting us today, right? We have a low literacy for that. And so these essays are trying to open people's eyes to these contemporary realities. I would finish with Nikita Stewart, who has just written so beautifully and done so much work about educational justice. She states in her essay, we are committing educational malpractice, why slavery is mistaught and worst in American schools. And so again, implicating present day institutions, our education system, in perpetuating, right, myths and falsehoods about slavery, right? And so the collection of these essays are really meant to do one thing and one thing is to tell the story of the American past and the American present and perhaps the American future through the lens of slavery. And if you do that, these are the kinds of conversations one has to engage in. And so I wanted to share these 6 contributions just to give you a sense of the depth of what this project offers. It's much more than an introduction from Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's this rich, multi-authored body of work that provides some really deep reflections on the history of slavery and slavery's legacy in the current moment. Now that we've kind of laid out some of the key contributors, I just want to talk about, just for a moment, what in my mind are the 4 critical questions that are at the heart of the 1619 Project. And I think it's really important for us to understand these are the questions that I believe are guiding the essays that were written, the podcasts that were deployed, and ultimately the book that will be released at the end of this year. But from my mind, the 4 key questions are: 1, what if Americans considered the year 1619 to be the founding year of the United States? What if we could stretch our imagination, and particularly our historical imagination, to imagine 1619 as the founding year of this country? What would that then mean for how we understand this country and this country's present? Second, what if Americans considered the 250 years of slavery as not a lens, but the lens through which we can best understand the development of the United States? What if we could shift, right, our historical consciousness in a way that we could focus on slavery as the lens that tells us more about ourselves, right, than it does just something about ourselves and our past? Third, what if Americans put slavery and the enslaved at the center of the story of American democracy? How would we then talk about American democracy differently if slavery and the enslaved are at the center? We would have to talk about them differently. We couldn't talk about them the same. And so that's the question, one of the questions at the core. And then finally, did the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution truly represent a triumph over tyrannical rule and the expansion of liberty and equality for all? Is that truly what the American Revolution accomplished? It's just a probing question, right? That's trying to get to not just what happened, but to get at the essence of what happened. and even to get at some of the deeper truths of what happened. This question is meant to try to excavate some of that. And so I think there are at least, 12 other questions that I could list here. But for me, these are the four central ones that at least help me to navigate what the contributors ultimately provide us in the essays and the poetry and the numerous just sort of just high quality understandings of the connection between slavery and the present. Now that we've kind of put on the table the questions, the probing questions that I think guide or undergird the 1619 Project, I want to be as transparent and clear about the argument, the overarching argument, right, that the 16 Project and its contributors make. And I think one of the key arguments that it makes, and one of the key objectives of the 1619 Project is to really urge readers, right, Americans, to reject what they consider a mythic history of the United States, right? The tone and the tenor, right, of the 1619 Project is calibrated in a way to position Americans or just simply readers to reject what they consider a mythic history of the United States. And there's a lot to be said in relationship to that point. What is a mythic history? But what the 1619 Project zeroes in on is what they think is the story of American democracy begins with the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. Like, that's, for them, the story of American democracy beginning with the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution flies in the face of and actually marginalizes and actually, in fact, excludes enslaved people from that telling, right? And so for them, a history that focused exclusively on 1776 and thereafter as the founding story or the founding of American democracy has omitted, right, enslaved people and slavery from that telling. The second point that they would point to in terms of a mythic history of the United States is that there is this sentiment that slavery and especially, the politics and economics of slavery, there's a sentiment that it was significant, but kind of tangential, significant, but tangential to the growth and the development of the United States, and especially American democracy. Like, slavery didn't really play a role, right, in that. That was separate. That was tangential. We don't need to muddy the waters and try to understand the relationship between these two things, right? They're separate, right? And so they would argue that that's the kind of mythic, feel-good history of the United States, and they want to reject that, right? And they want to reject that in favor of what historians or experts call the American paradox, right? I think what the 1619 Project does perhaps better, does best, is really shine a bright light on the American paradox. And this may be a term that many Americans or just individuals who are not in the academy have probably encountered. And so I want to just try to explain what this term means, or at least what I mean by this term when I in the context of this presentation. And so the American paradox really refers to the contradiction between America's professed founding values, and we can say liberty, equality, um, in short, but it's the contradiction between the professed founding values and the denial of those same principles to women, to enslaved Africans, and indigenous people. And so this American paradox is really trying to grapple with how is it that this beacon on the hill, this world's first true democracy, also be a society that enslaved hundreds and ultimately millions of people of African descent. How can those two things go together? And so the American paradox is about trying to understand how, you know, a you know how a democratic republic could become the most powerful slave society the world has ever seen. How is that possible? Right? At least in the modern world. How is that possible? And so if we go deeper and really and specifically try to explain how the 1619 project deploys this American paradox paradigm, I would just point to two things. The first is, when we talk about the American paradox, we have to talk about the ways in which American democracy, or democracy for white people, was achieved by a system of racial slavery. It was based upon racial slavery. So democracy for whites, and I would say land-owning, slave-owning white men, democracy for them was rooted in and made possible by a system of racial slavery or chattel slavery. And this then elevated white people, right? Not white women, but white men as a category above that of enslaved Africans, and for that matter, white women and indigenous people. But American democracy was not achieved through the American Revolution and winning the war against Britain, right? That was important, but how was it achieved actually on an operational basis? Through racialized slavery, or at least the contention for historians and certainly the 1619 project. It was achieved through the denial, the systematic denial of human rights to enslaved people. A third and equally important point in this sort of American paradox paradigm is that American democracy, American culture, the economy especially, far from being tangential, significant but tangential, was inextricably tied to and propelled by the expansion and consolidation of slavery between 1619 and 1865, right? And so, again, when we're trying to understand this American paradox, these are the presuppositions and points of departure for trying to grapple with how a country that professes to be a shining light for democracy and for human liberty could at the same time enslave so many, deny that very thing to so many millions of enslaved Africans, let alone to talk about the dispossession of Native Americans. And so these are the kind of core points that are being in various ways extrapolated on in the essays and the poetry, et cetera, that constitutes the 1619 project. Now, I want to just put an exclamation point on this by sharing with you a quote from the podcast, in fact, the 1619 podcast, in which Nicole Hannah Jones tries to articulate what's at the core of why she's writing what she's writing and why she's taking the positions that she's taking. Nicole Hannah Jones states on the American Paradox, quote, "And so the colonists have a choice to make. Are they going to be the country of their ideals, the ideals that they were putting on paper, a country based on the idea that all men were created equal? And if they're going to be that country, then they're going to have to abolish the institution of slavery. Or were they going to be wedded to the institution of slavery because they depended so heavily on the wealth that was being generated from it? And in that case, they can't really write the document that they want to write. And so what they do is they decide that they're going to try to have it both ways. And they bake that contradiction right into the Constitution, both codifying and protecting the institution of slavery, but never actually mentioning the word. And so they have written what is perhaps the most radical constitution in the world. And from the beginning, they knew that they were going to violate its most sacred, I would say, and most essential principles. They call this new country a democracy, but it wasn't one, not yet. And that not yet is to emphasize even today, not yet. And so I say all this to say that the American paradox of slavery and freedom is the paradox, is the kind of paradox that animates the 1619 project. Its tone and tenor, right, are decidedly, I would say, highlighting the bitter and harsh truths, the bitter realities of what it's meant to be Black in American society. But it certainly is rooted in this framework of the American paradox of American slavery and American freedom. And so I say all that to say that the net result of the 1619 project is to center slavery and the enslaved in US history. Like that is what the series does, I think, for me. It's helped me to position myself to understand our country's history from the vantage point of the enslaved. And that positionality, I think, offers more than, I would say, it offers us such a rich and deep understanding that we should be applauding in many ways the 1619 project for doing this, not dismissing it for perhaps, and I'm going to get into some of the controversial statements that has been associated with it. But for me, I just need to just for a moment to say that we should on the one hand be thanking them for centering a history and a people's history in a way so that we can understand the American past perhaps and feel it, I think is a better word, feel this history in a new way. And so the net result of this project is that we understand, right? I think many more Americans understand now how deeply rooted slavery is in the American past. And if we're going to talk about slavery, we have to start with the slave trade. And if we start with the slave trade, we need to note that more than 12 million enslaved Africans from various parts of the continent were kidnapped and forcibly transported to European colonies in both North and South America for 400 years, between the 15th and 19th centuries. And that of that 12 million, approximately 1 million to 1.5 million enslaved Africans were purchased in British North American slave markets. And so when we think about the transatlantic slave trade, when we think about the ways in which slavery knitted together the world and how capitalism, modern capitalism, grows out of slavery, we can't tell that story without talking about the 12 million. We should not tell that story without talking about the 12 million enslaved Africans that were kidnapped and forcibly transported to North America or to North American colonies. We also should be honest about what slavery truly was. And if we talk about what slavery truly was, we have to use the word chattel slavery. Slavery took many forms in world history. Right? But when we talk about slavery in America or American slavery, we have to talk about chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is the buying and selling of human beings. Focusing on chattel slavery and using that word is very important. I would say that additional points that should be made if we're going to center this history as the 1619 Project does is that between 1789 and 1850, 10 of the first 12 US presidents either had been or were active slave holders when elected to office. 10 of the first 12, right? Now, that doesn't tell us everything, but that does tell us something profound about how deeply entrenched slavery was, not just in American politics, but in American life, when 10 of the first 12 presidents are slaveholders, right? And what it kind of suggests to us is the ways in which during this period, when there are 10 of the first 12 presidents are slaveholders, during that time, Congress passed legislation, a series of compromises, and there are better people to tell you about those than me, but a series of compromises that protected the right to own slaves, right? We have to center these kinds of points in a telling or in a centering of slavery and the enslaved. Last but not least, I would just say that during the 1800s, right, cotton as a cash crop, planted and picked by enslaved laborers, accounted for more than half of all US exports. And the cumulative value of enslaved labor exceeded that of all US railroads and factories combined. And so, far more than being important or even significant, in this telling, slavery is foundational to the American economy. Slavery is the engine of the American economy. And so the idea that slavery could be the engine of the economy, let's say beginning in the 1790s with the invention of the cotton gin, and somehow that's not related to American democracy, is where the disconnect is for so many. And so I point out all this to say that when we put slavery and the enslaved at the center of US history, we have to tell a different story. We can't tell the same story that we've told, at least in American public memory, about slavery. Those things just don't go together. And so the 1619 Project, what it's tried to do is to do something that we don't typically do, which I hope we will do more now that Juneteenth is a federal holiday, but we certainly haven't done it in the past, is center the enslaved and center slavery in our conversations about the American past. If anything, we've treated it as tangential. We treat it as significant, but tangential. And that's something that the 1619 Project is trying to explode. And on those grounds, I applaud them deeply. So let's get to why, in the time that I have left, with why the 1619 Project is so polarizing. And for me, I would say that I've been shocked. I've been aghast with the energy of the opponents or those who oppose some of the claims in the 1619 Project. I haven't been surprised by the energy or the vehemence of conservatives, because this is a traditional bailiwick for them. But for some historians who have been just diametrically opposed, and then those who have cast cast the project in sort of in such a bad light, I've been miffed by. And I've been miffed by it in part because, for me, the 1619 Project does not advance a new or radical perspective on American slavery or its centrality, right? It just doesn't do that. I think it really is an attempt to be a bold retelling, but it's not a new one or a radical one. And I say that because, the many of the points made in the 1619 Project and the kind of harsh tone and criticism, we can find that during the American Revolutionary era, as well as in the Civil War era. That same critique is there, right? And that critique, I would argue, Black abolitionists drew the most attention to it, certainly in the years leading up to the Civil War, but you could even trace it back to the American Revolution. Black abolitionists drawing attention to the hypocrisy of American slavery and the ways in which the American Revolution did not address that question. And so Frederick Douglass's, I would argue, his 1852 speech on the 4th of July, entitled "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," represents, I think, the most eloquent statement on the American paradox and the ways in which, American democracy was a hypocrisy, right? And in this speech, just to talk about it just a little, Douglass confronts the mostly white audience and says to them, "Why have you brought me here? Someone who was previously enslaved, and even the threat of slavery is still a reality for him. Why have you asked me to speak about the 4th of July, when as a slave I experienced nothing of liberty and equality? Why have you brought me here to mock me, right? Have you brought me here to mock my kindred who still find themselves in bondage?" And so you only have to read his 1852 speech to perhaps hear the most eloquent telling of American democracy as a kind of hypocrisy, but certainly that really draws attention to the American paradox of slavery for Black people and freedom for white men or for white people. Right? He really, really brings that home in ways that even in the 1619 Project is missing. And that's no critique of it. It's just to speak of Frederick Douglass's immense power of the written word to really help Americans feel why he was deeply disenchanted with America, and perhaps most on the 4th of July. I want to emphasize that this is not new by just mentioning how since the 1950s, American historians, but specifically white American historians, have meticulously documented the centrality of slavery to the development of the United States, as well as shine a glaring light on the inconsistencies between the lofty revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality for all on the one hand, and then 250 years of chattel slavery on the other. There is a tradition within American scholarship that shined a light on this very paradox. And so what the 1619 Project is doing or has done is what has been done by previous historians. So I don't see anything new or radical, right? I know the tone is certainly different because it's representing the urgency of the now, but the basic concepts and frameworks are are much older, right, and are part of a much longer tradition than we have talked about and we've acknowledged in our debates about the merits of the 1619 Project. So I wanted us to very clearly understand it's a deeply rooted tradition. But this is what I've tried I've tried to help us to understand the parts of the 1619 Project that should not be controversial. But there's certainly aspects of it that are, and I want people to understand. I want people to know that even though in general I support the approach and aims of the 1619 Project, I can also see some of the perhaps the errors or miscalculations, if you will, as it relates to it. And so, if there's been one line that has drawn the ear of so many, whether it's historians or conservatives, it's been the line that you see in front of you. And I will read it. Nicole Hannah-Jones, in the introductory essay of the 1619 Project, states, one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. I want to repeat this. One of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence, not just because they were upset with the British Crown for imposing taxation without representation, but one of the primary reasons was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. And this one sentence sent shockwaves through the historical profession and ultimately through American television waves and airwaves. And I would say perhaps one of the most strident critics of this 1619 Project, and particularly some of its most controversial statements, has been Princeton professor, historian, colleague, Sean Wilentz. And Sean took deep issue to this statement that I just read multiple times. And he was quoted in The Atlantic in response to this statement to say, to teach children that the American Revolution was fought in part to secure slavery would be giving a fundamental misunderstanding, not only of what the American Revolution was about, but what America stood for and has stood for its founding. And so it's almost as if the 1619 Project and this particular statement posed a kind of existential crisis to what, for some, American history is about or was about. And so I want to just, pause for a minute, because I certainly don't want to minimize, those who have critiqued this claim, right? But what I would want to remind people of is that this project was about centering slavery and the enslaved in the retelling of American democracy. And so for the enslaved, or if we're trying to understand this history from the vantage point of enslaved Africans who saw in American revolutionary rhetoric a possible end to their long nightmare of bondage, that in the end, American patriots betrayed their principles in favor of codifying slavery in the Constitution. That represented a fundamental rejection of the revolution's radical aims. And so for me, it makes complete sense for the enslaved, for abolitionists, to view the American Revolution as ultimately a pro-slavery insurrection that did much to deepen the nation's commitment to that peculiar institution. And so I think the I would say that the American Revolution, just to try to flesh out where this kind of statement would come from, the American Revolution then was a pro-slavery insurrection in its outcome, especially from the vantage point of the enslaved. It wasn't a pro-slavery insurrection in its intent. And that's what the New York Times, that's what Nicole Hannah-Jones get wrong. The American Revolution was pro-slavery in its outcome, not in its intent. And so while the statement is certainly problematic and erroneous on its merits, on its face, I think Nicole Hannah-Jones' introductory piece, not just that one line, but introductory piece, centers the perspectives, the sentiments, and I would even go as far as saying the suspicions of enslaved people who witnessed and ultimately were disappointed in the revolution's outcome. And so in making that statement, I think a lot more is being channeled that we seemingly refuse to acknowledge. We only want to talk about its empirical veracity. And that's important. And we should talk about that. But let's try to get to the deeper, let's try to excavate the deeper truths that lie just beneath that statement. Okay. And so, and also let's not forget that if we tell the story of the American Revolution from the vantage point of the slave or the enslaved, it's not going to sound like the same history told from the vantage point of white colonists, right, and their grievances. And so if we can be honest about all these things, I think we get to a different place in discussing these histories. I want to just finish by highlighting why I think the 1619 project matters. And ultimately, for all of the debate, right, that the 1619 project has sparked, right, and I would say heated debate, some of the most heated debate that I've experienced personally as a historian and seen happening in multiple corners of American society, right? I think the sum total of all of that, right, has meant that this is perhaps the most important societal debate that we've had in a generation about slavery, right, as it's connected to the nation's founding. And so if the 1619 project accomplished nothing else, it's accomplished that, right? And that's worthy of applause, right? That, we talk so much about, making sure that we include diverse perspectives and inclusive perspectives on our history. This debate forced, right, that to the forefront, right? And we kind of saw, I think, a reaction to what that looks like and what that feels like in the debate on the 1619 project. Just in a nutshell, there's been so much that has occurred that has both divided us and brought us together as it relates to the 1619 project. There has been, sort of an anti-democratic wave of legislation that attempts to put limits on the teaching of slavery, as well as critical race theory. But at the same time, right, the 1619 project has propelled the United States Congress to pass historic legislation, making Juneteenth, right, a federal holiday, right? And so this project is polarizing in part because it has inspired such radically different responses to it. And so ultimately, for me, when we think about the 1619 project, we have to center what it really does best. And that is highlight the centrality of slavery to the American past and the present, in ways that help us understand the present, and especially issues such as poverty, issues such as healthcare, issues such as voting rights, mass incarceration, police brutality. Just read the 1619 Project, and it will illuminate the connections between slavery and the present. But I think the most important thing is it centers slavery and the enslaved. And if we can center them on issues as it relates to healthcare, as it relates to voting rights, mass incarceration, we can get on the right side of this history, and we can do right on these issues, these urgent issues of healthcare, voting rights, mass incarceration, police brutality. And so, in a nutshell, the 1619 Project, I think, illuminates an experience in ways, and makes us feel this history in ways that we haven't perhaps in a generation.